Hello YouTube! In this video I want to discuss what I think is quite a remarkable passage from David Hume concerning belief in the afterlife. Now, Hume is known for his criticisms of belief in the afterlife, presented in his essay Of the Immortality of the Soul. But there's also an interesting part in the Treatise where he suggests that very few people actually believe in the afterlife anyway, or as Hume puts it, most lay people, and I quote, have no formal principles of infidelity, yet they are really infidels in their hearts, and have nothing like what we can call a belief in the eternal duration of their souls. That is, most of the people who profess belief in the afterlife are engaging in a kind of self-deception. They don't really believe it. This would be a fairly controversial claim even today, but back in Hume's day, it was a truly incredible thing to say. So why does Hume think this? Well, the actual passage where Hume talks about this is it's quite brief. He raises a number of points, but he's quite brief about them. So I'm kind of filling in some of the background of Hume's views here in order to explain how I think his argument is supposed to work. So first of all, it's worth specifying exactly what Hume takes belief to involve. As Hume sees it, belief in a proposition is distinguished from other ways of thinking about the proposition, simply with regard to what Hume calls the force or vivacity with which the proposition is held. He says, and I quote, "Belief does nothing but vary the manner in which we conceive any object, and it can only bestow on our ideas an additional force and vivacity." So consider the proposition, God exists. Well, I can imagine that God exists, I can entertain the hypothesis that God exists, I can wonder if God exists, and so on, or I can believe that God exists. How does belief differ from these other attitudes? Well, clearly, the content of the proposition doesn't change. Whether I'm imagining that God exists or believing that God exists, the same proposition, the same idea is present in my mind, right? God exists, and I have the same concept of God and the same concept of existence, whether I'm imagining or believing. So what changes is the force with which that content is held. Hume calls it a superior force, or vivacity, or solidity, or firmness, or steadiness. Now, Hume admits that this characterization is vague. Believing a proposition feels different from imagining or considering or hypothesizing a proposition, but it's hard to state exactly what that feeling is. But Hume does think that this is relatively uncontroversial. So one aspect of belief is the force with which it's held. Moreover, this force gives the ideas that we believe a greater influence upon us. Hume says it makes them appear of greater importance, infixes them in the mind, and renders them the governing principles of all our actions. So here's a second aspect of belief. Beliefs will be used in reasoning and will govern our actions. If I feel hungry, I get up and go to the fridge because I believe that there is food in the fridge. I might imagine all sorts of things. I can imagine that the fridge is empty, that the fridge is occupied by a blood-sucking vampire, or that the fridge doesn't exist. What actually moves me is the belief. So we have this idea then that beliefs are held with greater force and beliefs govern our actions. Well, with this in mind, let's turn to belief in the afterlife. On this point, Hume makes several points as to why people don't really believe this, or at least most people. So first of all, the afterlife is far removed from our comprehension, in that we have no idea in what sense we will exist once the physical body dies. Now, Hume is a bit vague about how exactly this point is supposed to work. But I think his argument is this: nobody has any experience of an afterlife, so nobody has any idea how the afterlife will compare to life on Earth. Nobody has any idea what our bodies and minds will be like in the afterlife. Well, we presumably won't even have bodies, right? So there's a radical difference. Of course, people can speak in vague general terms about the afterlife. But if you try to dig into the details, you're going to run into immediate problems. So if I die at age 90 with Alzheimer's, presumably I'm not going to bring the Alzheimer's with me into the afterlife. So my mind is going to radically change. I mean, like, this is, of course, we're assuming here a kind of traditional Christian background, right? So the afterlife is supposed to be some sort of paradise or hell. But yeah, so you know, if I'm dying at age 90 with Alzheimer's, you know, I'm not going to be bringing my body with me, and I'm not going to be bringing all the properties, at least, of my mind with me either. And when we try to conceive of the afterlife, we might imagine ourselves seeing and smelling and touching things, but these are biological senses. And again, you know, the body's not going to accompany me into the afterlife, so the very means of receiving information will change. Like, my very form of experience will change. How exactly will it change? Well, nobody knows. Okay, so I think most people would agree that if there is an afterlife, we can't really describe what it will be like. It's going to be radically different. But why would it follow from this that people don't actually believe in the afterlife? Well, this connects, I think, to Hume's account of personal identity over time. I do have a video on this if you're interested in more detail, but the basic idea is that the reason why we treat people as having identity over time is resemblance between the different states over time. So consider a case of two cases of objects changing over time, represented by these two sequences. In the first case, you can see there's this sudden large change, right? You go from the ABCD to DDDD, right? And as a result, we would view this as two separate objects. So if you imagine this as tracking changes in an object, we would be inclined to say that the first object, ABCD, the first object is destroyed and then a second created in its place. So like, imagine if I had an acorn 1 second and then I snapped my fingers and an oak tree appeared in place of the acorn. We'd think of that as being like one object becoming something else. In the second case, there's gradual change over time. At each moment, there's significant resemblance to the previous moment. Now in this case, we think of this as a single thing changing over time. But retaining some identity through those changes. So think of an acorn growing into an oak tree. Even though the end state is significantly different from the first state, because there is this resemblance between the contiguous states, we view it as one object, the same object undergoing changes over time, not as a succession of completely different objects. And the key here, of course, is resemblance. There is significant resemblance in the object from one moment to the next. In fact, it may even seem like perfect resemblance if the changes are slow enough to be imperceptible. So, when two states are contiguous in time and closely resemble each other, what happens is that the mind easily conflates the two states, treating them as the same. And so, because it's assuming because it treats these two states as the same, it assumes identity over time. And the same occurs with persons. My characteristics at a later time strongly resemble my characteristics at an earlier time. Those later characteristics may have been caused by those earlier characteristics, and these two states may be contiguous in time, you know, like 1 minute to the next minute. And so, because of this resemblance, my mind is misled into assuming that there is something, some object, some substance that persists through these changes, that confers identity over time. Again, if you want more detail on Hume's views on the afterlife, on identity rather, as I say, I have other videos on that, but hopefully this, you can kind of get the point, right? Like, the identity over time is a sort of something we're projecting onto the world, onto certain types of changes in the world. But this does not hold for the afterlife. In the case of the afterlife, there is sudden radical change at one moment. And it's not just sudden radical change, it's change of a sort that we can't even conceive. We don't even know the extent of the changes. So our minds are going to have no inclination to attribute identity over time to the living person and the soul in the afterlife. And no amount of reasoning, no amount of arguments for the afterlife can overcome this difficulty. Because identity over time is ultimately not something that is discovered by evidence or argument. It's something that is projected. It's a kind of product of the natural tendencies of the mind to conflate resembling states. So yeah, because of Hume's view of personal identity over time, of how that works, right? There's not going to be a tendency for the mind to treat the person, the sort of dying person, and the soul in the afterlife as the same thing, right? They're just completely different things. In some ways, this is kind of the converse of Hume's point about skepticism of the senses, which I examined in a recent video. The common sense belief about the senses is that they give us direct perceptual access to material bodies. Now, there are very powerful skeptical arguments against this view, but Hume says that as soon as philosophical reflection ceases, we just fall back into the common sense belief. Right? The moment you walk outside the study and start interacting with other people and other things, the moment you start, playing billiards with your friends, you just believe that these other people and other things really exist. We can't give up these beliefs because our sensory impressions impose themselves upon us with too much force, or because of the sort of just natural sort of tendencies of our mind. So there are certain beliefs that are resistant to argument. But the opposite side to this coin is that arguments in favour of a belief are powerless when experience is silent. And this is the case for the afterlife. We have no impressions of the afterlife, no regular testimony from people who have been there, and it bears no resemblance to our ordinary experiences of our bodies and our minds. Sudden radical change. And so, it just doesn't matter what arguments you come up with, right? The mind is not going to project identity onto the dying person and the soul in the afterlife. Ultimately people, for this reason, are not going to hold a genuine belief in an afterlife. Right? Even if, maybe when they're engaged in philosophical argument, they can sort of push themselves in that direction. It's not going to be a sustained belief. So that's one point Hume makes. I think that's probably his central one, but he raises a number of other points as well. So a second point, which he's not quite explicit about, but I think is certainly hinted at in his discussion, is that people's concerns are, as a matter of fact, directed simply to this world, not to the afterlife. Recall the idea that beliefs should motivate action. Now, the problem is that professed belief in the afterlife just doesn't motivate action in the way we would expect. Hume notes that when people compare the pleasures and pains, the rewards and punishments of this life with those of the afterlife, almost all of their reasoning and behaviour is directed to the former. It's directed to the pleasures and pains of this life. Now, Hume doesn't really elaborate this point, but again, we can fill in the details. Some people will claim to believe in the certainty of eternal punishment for behaviours that they themselves engage in. It's not exactly unusual to find the most superficially devout people breaking the rules of their own religion. Moreover, you get cases where people will mourn the deaths of loved ones even though they claim to believe that those loved ones are now in paradise and that they will all be reunited relatively soon. Given that this existence in the afterlife is supposed to be an eternity, seems like pretty much all of our behaviour should be organised so as to maximise our rewards in that context. But that's just not how humans actually behave. One interesting point that Hume does make in this context is that we often find that people are concerned about what will happen after their death, but only so long as it is with respect to this world. So a person might worry about what their reputation or legacy will be. How will I be remembered once I'm dead? And then I may take steps in my behaviour to secure the outcomes I desire, to ensure that I have a lasting legacy among the living. People do care about what happens after their death, but their concern is for what happens in this world. We just don't see similar concern for what will occur in the afterlife, according to Hume anyway. And yet the stakes there are significantly higher, because again, that's an eternity. Okay, so a third point. Hume notes the inconsistency of people's judgments concerning the afterlife. He gives the example of Roman Catholics. He says that they are the most zealous of the Christian sects, yet even they will condemn the barbarity of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which was a wave of mob violence where Catholics killed thousands of Protestants during the French Wars of Religion. Now, this massacre was committed against the very people who Catholics claim to believe will be committed to eternal torture in the afterlife. And where, this is like the justice of God. But this doesn't make any sense, right? So the judgments that Catholics are making is that the one day of violence in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, right, that's barbarous, but eternal torture is just. I mean, Hume thinks that this is just obviously inconsistent. And the best explanation for this is that these Catholics do not really believe what they profess to believe about the afterlife. If in our hearts we recognise that the idea of eternal torture is just a fiction, well, naturally it's not going to excite our passions and we're not going to be inclined to condemn it. We have negative attitudes to certain forms of behaviour, right, to violence, aggression, torture. Normal people will respond negatively to these kinds of things, even if like there are specific contexts where we might recognise that violence and aggression are acceptable, such as in punishment. Even there, we still have some sense of proportionality. If we were to genuinely believe that some people, even very bad people, were subjected to extreme eternal suffering, right, we would respond negatively to that. The fact that hell doesn't provoke this response suggests that it's not a genuine belief. Or at the very least, like, this seems inconsistent with like the responses that we have to suffering and violence and so on in this world. A final point that Hume makes is that with respect to religion and the afterlife, people enjoy fear and other negative emotions. He notes that the most successful preachers are those who terrify their audiences. He says, no preachers are so popular as those who excite the most dismal and gloomy passions. Now, in everyday life, fear is disagreeable. We don't like being afraid. If I fear that I won't be able to pay the bills this month, that's a very unpleasant state. And this is because fear is connected to genuine belief, right? I believe that I won't make enough money. I believe that this might lead to the electricity being shut off, whatever. And that's not pleasant. But Hume points out, right, there are contexts where we do take pleasure from fear, and that's when we're engaging with fiction. In this case, Hume says, the passion, being softened by want of belief in the subject, has no more than the agreeable effect of enlivening the mind. Negative emotions become enjoyable when they're not prompted by genuine belief. So Hume's point seems to be that people's engagement with religion is actually very similar to their engagement with fiction. In both cases, they seek out and take pleasure from negative emotions like fear. Again, the best explanation for this is that actually most people recognise that the religious claims just are fiction. So there you go. That is Hume on belief in the afterlife, on why it is that most people, at least who profess to believe in the afterlife, do not really do so. And I just thought that was kind of interesting, especially given the time he was writing. Anyway, that is all for today.